I have my pieces all here that have already been bisque fired. So it's important that your stuff is bisque fired first. Not only does it make your wares more durable so they can withstand the liquid application of glaze and not dissolve, but it also burns out any organic impurities that might be in the clay body, and sometimes those organic compounds can give negative results with the glazes. So it's just important that your stuff is bisque fired first. I'm actually going to draw a little picture of each piece. So this is a small pinch form that I made, and just to help me remember what it is, I'm going to just do a little abstract drawing here on my piece of paper, and then I'm going to write on the drawing the different glazes that I want to use. I think there's something about this piece that looks like a flower or a piece of fruit, so I'm going to try and get some pink colors on it. And pink is not really a color that we have in a little cup, so I'm going to mix a few different glazes together and see what kind of pink color I can get. I think I'll start with a base coat of white glaze, and then I will put maybe the goldenrod on top, and then a thin coat of the red glaze on top of that. And that's all just on the inside of the piece. On the outside of the piece, I'm going to try something different. I think it's nice to have different colors on the inside from the outside. It can help your piece look more expansive. It could help maybe play up the sense of containment that it has. It's definitely going to give me an interesting back and forth color relationship going on between the inside and the outside, and maybe it'll help play up all these lines and the shape of the rim on the piece. So I am going to write down something different I want on the outside. Maybe I'll try the red glaze with the white on top of that. I hope by now you have gone in and looked at the matrix of glazes that we have. The matrix shows what all of the glazes look like individually as well as layered on top of each other. So go look at the matrix picture of all the glazes. The matrix does not show you what the glazes will look like on the red clay body. The matrix is just on the white clay body, but those are using red clay. You can just make a mental adjustment that everything you get is going to be a little darker and more red toned underneath. They actually look beautiful on the red clay. The matrix also does not show you the difference between glazes and underglazes. So just to clarify it for everyone, the glazes are all in the big cups and they say glaze on the label. The underglazes are in the smaller cups and they all say underglaze on the label. The main difference is that glazes in general get shiny when they're fired in the kiln. Underglazes do not get shiny by themselves. If you want an underglaze to be shiny, you have to use it with a glaze. This is a small tile that I made, and I pressed a stamp, several stamps that I made into the clay on here. So on this piece, I really want to play up the texture. I'm going to draw a little picture of it. And on this one, I think I'm going to use something light colored on the background. Maybe I will try out my peacock glaze. And then on top of that, I'll try some darker colors, maybe the black and the Turkish amber. Here's another tile that I made that already has some underglazes on it. These underglazes I put on in the greenware state. So these underglazes have already gone through the first bisque firing. Now I want to see what some different glazes might look like on top of these underglaze colors. The most obvious glaze to try on top of the underglazes would be the clear. The clear glaze on top is just going to give a glossy, completely clear coating on it. So I'm going to try the clear glaze. I also want to see what some colored glazes look like on top of here. I'm curious if I put the robin's egg glaze on top of these colors, will the colors show through? There's one way to find out. I'm going to put some of this on and fire it and see how much of these colors show through. So I'm going to write that down. And I'm also curious what the white glaze might look like on top of these colors. I encourage you to use your bisque sample pieces at this point for as much testing as you possibly can. You have to take notes somehow. Whatever note-taking system works for you is fine, but you will not remember what you put on them when you send them through and drop them off and pick them up a week later. You absolutely have to have it written down. And when you show and turn in the pictures of your work completely finished, I'm going to ask you to turn in your notes also. So either it's going to be in a format like this, or it's just going to be in a written out list, whatever it is. I need to clearly be able to see what you put on your pieces. For brushes, I have a few brushes at home already. You can use just regular hardware store paint brushes. I also had a couple of softer makeup brushes at home. These both work great, but I also have some regular kind of art store paint brushes that are going to work nicely also. Hopefully you have a few brushes at home. You can get brushes, even good quality brushes like this, at most big grocery stores. If you wanted to go to an art supply store and get some brushes, that would be great. Also, you could use the brushes that we have in the lab at Clark College if you wanted to come in and just use some of the paint brushes that we have there. As I am laying it on, I am also trying to spread it around and to get an even coat of glaze. I don't want all the little brush strokes to show. So I can see where the glaze is thicker, where drips have accumulated, just the marks of my brush. And as the glaze dries on here, I'm going back and spreading it all around so it's more even. I don't want the piece to look streaky. I don't want, on this piece, I don't want any evidence of paintbrush marks. I want just a solid coat of glaze. On this surface, I'm actually going to layer 3 different glaze colors on top of each other. This is just the first base coat of white. I want to put another coat on right now, but it hasn't fully dried yet. And I think this is why most people get the glaze on too thin when they're glazing the first time, is because they just don't wait for it to dry. That's an important part of the process. If I try and brush on more glaze right now, I might inadvertently wind up swiping some off if it's still wet. So this has what I would say 2 thin coats on it right now, and I'm just going to set it aside and let it sit and dry for 10 minutes. Can make all the difference in getting it on the right thickness. This glaze has been settling for a while, and it had just some standing water on top. So I'm really making sure that I stir it up with my paintbrush before I use it. This is kind of a thicker, wider paintbrush, so it's really going to do a nice job of laying the glaze on this tile. The bisqueware underneath the glaze looks kind of pinkish, and I can see some of that around. So even though I want to put another coat on this, I'm going to let it dry first for about 5 or 10 minutes. On this tile, I have some white glaze on this part that I'm going to see how those underglaze colors show through or not. And then in this area of it, I'm putting on some of the robin's egg. Want to spread it around, so I don't want to see the individual brush strokes. And then I'm going to try some clear glaze in the other corner. Now I'm putting a coat of the goldenrod glaze on top of the white glaze that I already put on there. I can look on the matrix and see what the goldenrod on top of the white should look like. Realize though that your results are gonna look different than what you see on the matrix. The matrix is just one person's example of a glaze on top of another glaze. It's gonna look different from you because I'm sure you're gonna put your glazes on slightly different thicknesses. You might have a different color clay body. There's all kinds of minute differences that means the matrix isn't an exact guarantee of what these combinations will look like, but it provides a good indication, and it certainly gives you a good starting place. If you think you want a certain color, the matrix can give you an indication of what direction to go in for you to try and achieve that yourself. These glazes will look different and distinct coming from your particular hand versus from another student's application of them. And it's all the more reason to practice and try out a bunch of different stuff at this point. You can't just go by counting how many coats you put on. That doesn't tell you everything you need to know about how thick the glaze is actually on the piece. For example, I discovered one of my glazes in one of these containers is a lot thinner than another glaze that I have. Maybe half as thick as this other glaze. So the same amount of coats from those two containers would give very different results. Also, just counting the coats doesn't take into account the paintbrush that you're using. So don't just go by counting how many coats you put on. Instead, I like to do a scratch test on the piece to try to actually measure in some kind of way how thick is this chalky application of glaze accumulated on the surface of the bisqueware. I'm going to do a little scratch test with the tip of my pin tool from my toolkit. You could use a safety pin or a needle or any kind of sharp scratching tool. I'm going to go onto the piece and literally scratch through the glaze with the pin. By scratching through it, I'm trying to assess how thick the glaze is on the piece to help guide me on the next time I glaze. If everything came back too thin, then I'll know whatever this looks like wasn't enough. Or if they were on too thick, then I'll know whatever that looks like was too much. I'm gonna put some black glaze on top of the peacock glaze on this piece to try to accentuate the texture that's underneath here. And I'm going to use some Turkish amber in these other little stamped areas. Now I'm going to go over this with some of the red glaze. As you get more and more coats of glaze on your bisqueware, it's going to take it longer and longer to dry in between each coat. So whereas the first coat might dry right away, the second coat might take 5 or 10 minutes to dry. Now I think this is the fourth coat I'm brushing on here, and I might need to let this dry for a half an hour or more to be totally dry again. But this is going to give me a really interesting result with these 3 different glazes layered on top of each other. Okay, now I'm going to glaze the back side of the piece. I'm going to start with a coat of the red. I want the color on the outside of this piece to be different from the inside, but somehow harmonize with the inside or enhance it. You can glaze the pieces all the way around, but I'm going to need to sponge this area clean before it gets fired in the kiln. Again, as I'm putting the glaze on, I'm trying to spread it around at the same time so that I don't get lots of little brush strokes showing up after it's fired. Drips aren't all bad, but a lot of the time drips are just a result of messy glaze application or applying it too quickly. So most of the time I try and brush out all the drips so they don't show. If I want a drip to show, I'm usually doing it in a specific place with a specific intention for it to show. Otherwise, I'm going to try and even them all out. If you feel like what you have is too thick, you can thin any of your stuff down with water that you want. The underglazes are really intense pigments. They're pretty much just only ceramic pigment. There's no glass forming or glaze making ingredients in them. So I like to use them when I want bright painting. The underglazes don't move at all when you put them on. So I can do lines with them or do writing with them or any kind of really clear graphic type work that I want to have, and I can be sure that those lines aren't going to move at all in the kiln firing, unlike the glazes, which do move a little bit when they melt. You can also layer the underglazes on top of each other, just like you do with the glazes. The underglazes are pretty easy to mix in with each other. So I'm going to do a little mixing here of my blue and my green together to get kind of a more subtle color. Sometimes the colors straight out of the container are a little too simple. Maybe I'll put a little bit of yellow in here too. Sometimes I like my colors to have a little more individuality to them. Or I want to try to make a specific color that nobody else has. I find that the underglazes can often be kind of like watercolor painting, where I can build up layers of color. So remember, these underglaze colors won't be shiny at all. I'll get really intense colors from them, but it'll be a dry surface, which is sometimes you want a dry surface. Sometimes, especially if you're making an organic piece, maybe making something that you want to look like a leaf, let's say, or tree bark, these things aren't really shiny and super glossy in real life. So sometimes just having underglaze color with no glaze on top is what you want. But if you want this to have a glassy surface to it, you have to put a glaze on top. The clear glaze on top is what most people do, but some of the other light colored glazes will allow these colors to show through somewhat as well. I recommend that you test a lot of different things at this point. I'm going to go on top of here with a little bit of black also, just for accent. Sometimes I find just a little bit of black can help the whole design come alive. What might be nice with this piece is to see both what the underglazes look like on their own without any glaze on top, and some areas that might have a clear glaze on top. So I'm going to focus on just the decoration part with some clear and try and leave the blue background mostly unglazed. So I'll get more information that way from this one tile. It's a good idea, especially at this early point in the term, to try out lots of different things on each individual piece that you have. So if you have 6 pieces, for example, don't just try only 6 things. Try 2 or 3 different things on each piece that you have. You want to get the most amount of information back with this first round of glaze testing as possible. So I'm going to let this dry and put on maybe another 2 or 3 coats like this until I build up that clear glaze, but I'm going to leave most of that blue background without any glaze on it at all. So on this piece, I have 3 different colors laid on top of each other on the inside, and I'm going to do that scratch test again to try and get a sense of how thick this is on here. To me, this feels pretty thick on there. You want this chalky glaze coat right now to be about as thick as a dime on the surface of your piece. And I feel like I'm close to that thickness on the inside. It's definitely not on as thick on the outside as it is on the inside. So I'm going to build up a few more coats on here. Remember, how thick your glaze is on your piece depends on a lot of different factors. depending on how thick it is in the container, what kind of paintbrush you're using, and how long you're letting it dry in between each coat that you put on. All of those things together contribute to how thick the glaze is actually on your piece. Over here, I have the robin's egg glaze, and I know they'll show through somewhat, but that robin's egg glaze is definitely going to affect the colors underneath it. And this area is just the clear glaze, and just the clear glaze is going to show the underglazes through as true as possible. You should feel free to experiment at this point. Try a little bit of everything that you got in your glaze kit. All the different glazes and all the different underglazes. Try them individually and try them in combination with each other. It's really important before you bring your stuff in to be fired that you check the bottom of everything that you have and make sure there's no glaze on the bottom. Inevitably, even if you didn't put glaze on the bottom, some glaze is going to drip down there, and you absolutely have to sponge off any drips of glaze that are on the bottom of your pieces. Also, not just on the bottom, but you need to clean the glaze up about 1/4 of an inch in the air from the bottom, because the glazes will move a little bit when they melt in the kiln. So on this flat tile, it means basically that I have to have the entire side edge of it cleaned free of glaze also. And you can just do that with a damp sponge. It should sponge off really easily. Okay, this piece has glaze all the way around it. So I'm gonna have to really sponge off quite a bit on this bottom area. I want to check how thick the glaze is on here first though. That's not quite as thick as a dime on the outside, but it's on there pretty thick. The inside is on thicker. One way to tell on a rounded form like this where 1/4 of an inch up in the air is to hold a pencil down on the table and come up against the surface of the piece, because a pencil tip is about 1/4 of an inch up in the air when you lay the pencil down flat. So I'm turning the piece around and just lightly marking it with the tip of my pencil. A loose circle on the bottom of my piece that's showing me where I need to sponge the glaze off. So I need to come inside of this circle and sponge off all of that glaze that I put on there. And if some of the glaze is still caught in these little crevices in here, as long as those crevices filled with glaze are elevated up off the table when this is turned upside right, it will be okay to fire it with that little bit of glaze caught in there. That's usually fine. But I do need to make sure that this glaze is wiped up, not just where it literally makes physical contact with the table, but everything about 1/4 of an inch up in the air around where it makes contact. Sometimes how the glaze ends on your piece is just as important as the other areas of your piece that have solid glaze on them. Okay, so when you're done glazing, there should be a thick, ample coat of glaze on all of your pieces, about as thick as a dime. Maybe you have different layers of different products on all your pieces. You've tried out everything that came in your glaze kit. You made sure that your bottoms are sponge clean, and 1/4 of an inch up in the air from the bottom is also sponge clean. And you have notes written down with everything that you have tried on all your pieces, all the layers in the right order, whether you're using glaze or underglaze, everything is written down on a sheet of notes. So when you get them back from the kiln firing, you can exactly tell us what is on every single area of every single piece. Once you've got that all set, you're ready to wrap them all back up again. You want to again cushion your pieces in crumpled newspaper or old rags or t-shirts. Be careful that you don't chip the glaze coat on any of them. It's this chalky coating on your pieces, and you don't want it to flake off at all, but you're gonna pack them back up again and drop them back off at Clark College for the glaze firing. It's super exciting to get your pieces back, and again, you're going to see not just your pieces, but you're going to get to see everybody's results in your entire class, which is great. We're going to have a ton of information after this. I can't wait to see your guys' results.